when I talk about the distinction between insurgents and incumbents, and I asked the group to sort of identify where their organization may fit on that kind of continuum. Oftentimes I will hear, well, where should I be thinking about that? Is that company-wide or a function within my company? Because there are certain areas of my company that are operating as real insurgents today, and others that might be somewhat more on the incumbent side. How do you deal with that when you're talking to customers and clients about this work?
Right. So I think there's three levels here. Hi, Rondo. How are you going today?
I'm well, Matt. How about you?
Well, I'm very excited to kick off our inaugural podcast series on insurgents and the insurgent mindset.
Yeah,
And just as an introduction, my name is Matt Tice. I'm the CEO of Insurgence Group. And joining me today is my colleague, Rondo Moses.
I'm Rondo Moses.
All right. So this is going to be really fun, Rondo. It's our opportunity to kind of bounce back and forth some ideas around this concept that we created almost a decade ago, which really gets to the heart of how insurgents can challenge incumbents in sort of volatile and changing markets, which is really gathered a lot of steam. And I think a lot of people are really interested in this topic, in particular, if you are a big, fat, slow, lazy incumbent, how do you sort of reprogram to be more like the challenger, more like the insurgent in our language?
Yeah, it's interesting. I have spoken to several executive organizations over the past couple of months about this concept of insurgents, and so many of them, when they hear that distinction that we make between insurgents and incumbents, are get an aha moment based on what's going on inside their own organizations and things that they could probably do to help them become more like insurgents.
Yeah, I think that's right. And over the years now, with thousands and thousands of people coming to our various events and speaking engagements and working through this sort of how do I build an insurgent mindset in the consulting work that we do and so forth, I think we've really discovered something special here. But why don't we start by perhaps unpacking a little bit what the mindset of the insurgent is, and sort of bring out, if you will, the contrast between the insurgent and the incumbent. And then what we can do is explore some examples, and as the podcast series sort of evolves, we'll get some case studies into the mix and talk to people who are out in the field applying these concepts and what they've learned, and how those concepts are driving value in their organizations. What do you think?
Agreed.
Sound
Agreed.
like a plan?
Sounds like a plan. However, I would say let's take a step back. I think it's worthwhile helping the audience know a little bit more about us. So why don't you tell them a little bit about yourself, your background, and I'll share a bit about myself as well.
Sure. Okay. Well, without being self-serving, I started my career working with the U.S. Navy, and it was a tremendously interesting and fun experience playing with big toys, primarily submarines. And sort of following that experience, I've been most of my career a professional advisor working with companies to help either initiate or defend against disruptive change, whether that be, sort of way back in the day in terms of things like Cisco challenging AT&T and Bell Canada, and fast forward to today, working with organizations across the economy on, big challenges that, this sort of very complex economy is bringing to these firms. So for my part, my role really has been to help companies navigate this change and work through these big challenges. And then importantly, once we understand what the problem is and how to solve it, is to drive that through to execution and make it happen. So that's really deep in my DNA. And, the firm that we've built, Rondo, together is really focused on, this idea of how can we help companies compete differently in the marketplace using these big ideas that sort of bring together the idea of how do you apply, if you will, innovation to strategy to discover new territory to compete.
Yeah,
How
and
about
just a
you?
little bit about my background. I started my professional career in the pharmaceutical industry in a variety of sales and national accounts management roles, and then I left for business school. I went to the University of Virginia Darden School. We both are Darden alum.
Good. Yep.
And after business school, I joined Doctors Kaplan and Norton, where we both worked helping organizations with strategy issues, implementing strategy management systems, et cetera. And I joined you at Insurgence about 10 years ago because I really had a passion for helping leaders to think of differently about operating in this kind of rapidly changing environment, helping them to address their over-reliance on outdated mental models and strategies that were really not relevant in, I would say, this kind of a rapidly changing business environment. So it's been great working with organizations of various sizes. My focus is of course, in North America, but just really helping leaders to think differently about the way that they're operating and how they can get more competitive advantage by sort of thinking outside the box.
So Rondo, why don't you start off and unpack the idea of insurgents for us, and we'll riff a bit on this topic and see where we land in terms of kind of creating a working definition for our listeners today, and see if see if we can't shed some more light on the topic.
Yeah, when I think about the concept of insurgents, I think about the ability of an organization to first starting with the customer as at the core of their thinking, to think differently about what they provide in the market, thinking more specifically about customers' needs and expectations, and building solutions, products, services, whatever they may be, to address those customer needs. You coined this term a while back, customer proximity. You know, that insurgents organizations know how to surround the customer rather than the customer having to surround themselves around that company. The insurgent organization is sort of hyper focused, relentlessly focused on the customer, in contrast to the incumbent organization that has probably experienced a lot of growth over the past, and they're so focused at this point in they're mature to a point where they're really just focused on functional efficiency. The insurgents organization really is keenly focused on customers and how they can better serve the customer, and that's what drives them. So I think that this idea, and by doing that, the insurgents organization is a lot more adaptable and flexible in the market, and can sense opportunities and go after those opportunities a lot more quicker than incumbent organizations.
That's a great call out. I think customer proximity is a really important sort of term. This idea of, if you take a firm and sort of almost measure the distance of the firm from the customer and the market, I think what we see with incumbents is, as they develop and grow, to your point, they get further and further away from the customer and the consumer, but also they look ever more inwardly, right?
Yes.
So inevitably that inward focus is, using your terminology there, that sort of functional efficiency. It's about how do we fine tune an existing business model with the assumption that market conditions are relatively stable and unchanging, which absolutely is not the world we live in today. And certainly, then how do we take what we have, which can be sort of, I guess, identified as a core model to create value, and then how do we extrapolate that value into ever more opportunities? Now, there's really nothing wrong with that, but I think when we study carefully the challengers, the insurgents in the market, how they come up against established incumbents and how often they disrupt them, the pattern is really almost always the same, in a sense that these firms are really, really tuned into how market changes and the needs of the customers are evolving. You kind of think about that frontier of the customer and the firm sort of ever retreating away from the firm as, the organization tries to catch up with, or, find new ways to create value for that customer. But big firms are really slow typically in terms of their ability to do this. And it provides a lot of opportunities for firms that have established, and I don't want to describe this as a small, large sort of dynamic. It's really it's a mindset dynamic, isn't it?
Yeah.
In a sense where you can see these firms when they're on the march, and fundamentally it boils down to me to two things. It's really understanding, as you pointed out, that frontier between the company and the customer, and it's really understanding the needs to evolve your business model to meet the new demands of the market. And certainly
Yeah.
I think that the incumbent is typically very poor at this because they tend to hard code, if you will, their business models, and they're not very pliable, largely because of a lot of things which we'll explore.
Right. But, that speaks to something that we know from working with clients and the work we've done is that most companies, when they think about innovation, they really think more about product and service innovation or operational innovation. And so what we like to think of, like to your point, they think from the inside out, as opposed to, the flip side being business model innovation and customer experience innovation. Like that would get them more focused on customers and the opportunities that are out there in the markets, and really what can they be doing to change the business model or create new business models to address unmet needs that they see developing in the market. I don't think enough companies spend enough time in those spaces really thinking about where the business model opportunities for them, as opposed to, like you said, leveraging more of the existing capability that they have and doing more of the same.
I think one of the reasons for that is the incumbent mindset is that innovation is something completely separate from operations, from strategy, from engagement with customers, or it's a tool set to provide over the top of what we're already doing. So therefore, we end up in these territories of how do I do product development a little bit better, or how do I drive more efficiency out of my existing operations and my existing business model and so forth. Whereas the insurgent mindset is innovation is everything that we do. Innovation is the model. Innovation is the strategy. Innovation is the way we engage with customers. And it's all wrapped up into this mindset of fundamentally, how do we challenge the existing incumbents in a particular marketplace, or how do we create new territory to compete? So in that sense, when you see a well-funded startup, or when you see an established business that has coded this mindset into their leadership behaviors, inevitably those organizations are looking for innovation opportunities across all these dimensions. Of course, we're always going to try to innovate products and services, and we're always going to try to make our processes better, faster, cheaper. But fundamentally, what they're doing is they're innovating around a whole different set of assumptions that drive how value is created in a marketplace. And that's really, quite exciting and fun to see. But you only know it when you're there, and you can see leadership and the teams all working really aimed at the customer, trying to accomplish, this change.
That's what I was going to say. Don't you think it's because they are so laser focused on the customers and the markets that they are able to see the need for innovation beyond just the traditional ways of thinking about innovation, and more people in the organization are engaged in the process. So innovation is not just the purview of a small group of people in the organization working in the back room, but that mindset, that innovation mindset, is sort of woven throughout the whole organization. Do you see that as sort of like the value of what insurgent organizations can do versus incumbent organizations?
I think you're right. I think like I said, once you visit an organization that has this culture hard-coded into, or soft-coded into their DNA, you can see what's happening. Everyone understands the customer need. You can see that, customers not happy, we iterate, we change, we adapt. You can see agile operating models, but importantly, you can also see, the way leaders are more hands-off, in a sense that they allow that mindset to take root, and they nurture individuals in the organization to find solutions to customer problems. Or importantly, and we haven't talked about this, that the competitors are a key part of this too, in a sense that, I think insurgent firms are hyper aware of how their would-be competitors are competing, and seek ways to undermine that sort of established approach in very material and important ways. So by fundamentally overturning, for example, the assumptions that that these incumbents might have in a particular market. So if you've been competing for an awfully long time, inevitably you start to believe your own sort of you start to believe your own sort of bull, if you can, if I can say that. And
Yeah.
inevitably what happens is that these organizations can't adjust, and therefore they become very vulnerable to the insurgent coming in and saying, you're not meeting the customer need, I can meet that need, but you're also not doing it in a way that creates value for the customer. I can fine tune the business model to achieve that. And then
Right.
third, you have a culture and a leadership structure that's very vertical, that's very slow, that's very
Right.
deliberative, that doesn't have that dynamic characteristic. And I can outcompete you on a much by creating a much faster clock speed for my organization. And I think, you bring those three ideas together, and all of a sudden you have, a formidable new way of competing, which creates a lot of trouble for the incumbent when there's a lot of change in the marketplace.
Sometimes when I have a presentation that I do for organizations around strategy, design, and execution in the age of disruption, and when I talk about the distinction between insurgents and incumbents, and I ask the group to sort of identify where their organization may fit on that kind of continuum, oftentimes I will hear, well, where should I be thinking about that? Is that company-wide or a function within my company? Because there are certain areas of my company that are operating as real insurgents today, and others that might be somewhat more on the incumbent side. How do you deal with that when you're talking to customers and clients about this work?
Right. So I think there's three levels here. Okay. So first, as a leader, do I exhibit the characteristics of the insurgent, or am I playing not to lose? Okay. So the insurgent plays differently to win, and the incumbent tries to preserve the status quo not to lose. Right.
Right.
So, and it's a very different mindset. So I think it starts with individual leaders trying to understand really how they approach business.
Because they set the tone. They set the
They
tone for the
set the
organization.
tone, certainly.
Yeah.
Then I think the next question is, as a firm, are we programmed to think differently about how we engage with customers? Building on the point we raised earlier, are we programmed to think differently about our business model? The answer usually is no, because most incumbent organizations, and it's a key characteristic, most don't really fully understand their business model, or at least fully understand where the opportunities are to change it. So I think it's a question of kind of the firm as an organism. To what degree is that firm, positioned in the market to be the insurgent, the challenger? And I think importantly, the third level is the culture. So it's one thing to have a firm that can operate this way. It's another thing to have leaders that think this way. But ultimately, you got to have a culture that sort of creates a pervasive mindset, which brings the insurgent thinking into how we approach problems, how we approach opportunities, et cetera. So I think those three, think about it like a triangle. I think they're really important elements. Now, if we zoom back a little bit further, you also have to consider that the insurgent firm inevitably evolves, and there's a lot of pressure for, I don't know if it's so much pressure, but I guess there's a gravity that pulls a firm towards incumbency. Okay.
Right.
So over a period of time, success breeds some confidence, and that confidence then kind of becomes ego, and that ego then becomes, okay, we've got a model, we're happy with that model, let's keep doing that forever until our back's against the wall. They used to call it the burning platform, but fundamentally, these days things are changing so quickly in the marketplace. You have to be able to occupy, now circling back to your question, you have to be able to occupy both spaces at the same time. Of course, if we have a model that works and there's lots of runway and there's lots of growth there, we've got to be able to fine tune and scale that model. But at the same time, we also have to be able to create an incredibly responsive and dynamic business that allows us to adjust to market conditions. So the answer to your question is, somehow you have to be a hybrid where you take the best of what incumbency brings to you, which is can carry certain advantages, but then by building that leadership, that firm focus, and that culture that is wired up to be more of an insurgent sort of mindset, that's where you're able to kind of have your cake and eat it too.
But do you think part of the challenge of, managing that pull toward incumbency is that, as insurgent organizations focus on customers and they start to understand those customers better and they start to perform better with customers, you start to get laser focused on the existing customers and you lose sight of maybe the newer opportunities and needs that are developing in the market because your business model, your processes are starting to get firmer and secure. Whereas in the beginning, you had a lot more flexibility, more nimble, but as you more mature, you start to put in processes that start to make the business model less flexible. And then over time, you wind up and your business model is moving more toward that because over focus on the customer, that specific customer segment and functional efficiency. And so you don't have the wiggle room to sort of go into different areas. Your management systems are set up in a way that you've got to deliver certain profitability and profits, et cetera. So it doesn't allow enough room to experiment with new markets, or you're assessing those opportunities with the same parameters that you would your more existing structured business. Is that the challenge that organizations have?
It's a challenge, but again, it's a mindset challenge. I think almost everything that you just said is the fallacy of the incumbent, in a sense of I sort of completely reject the idea that we have to trade a unit of profit for a unit of flexibility, right? So I think that having a flexible, if you will, a flexible architecture for the business is fundamental to the insurgent mindset. Whereas having a fixed architecture for the business is a key characteristic of the incumbent, right? So if you look at these sort of two kinds of firms side by side, the incumbent will try to extract profit from the market by, as I mentioned before, extrapolating their current model to, on the assumption that the customer or a group of customers that sort of gravitate towards that particular firm's products and services are largely fixed and unchanging. Whereas the insurgent takes a view that the market is dynamic, customers will evolve, they'll retreat away from us and come back to us. We always have to be fine-tuning and adjusting our model to find new ways to capture that value and ultimately to extract that profit from that value in a way that allows us to reinvest to create the next set of opportunities in the market, as compared to only just continuing to extract value from a fixed model. And I think that's really important. So, fundamentally, the insurgent approach is to build a flexible architecture for the business that allows you to be very dynamic and responsive to changing customer needs, changing market dynamics, and of course, other competitors that are maybe coming in from left field that are challenging established markets already. So it's much, I think, compared to 20 years ago, it's much more complex to compete now. So you have to have almost a 360-degree viewfinder to really understand what's happening in the market. But many incumbent firms just have a zero-sum sort of approach where traditional customers, traditional competitors, traditional model, and that, I think, really creates a limited, if you will, perspective in the market, which at best costs these firms in terms of opportunities they might otherwise have realized, but at worst puts them in dire straits when either significant new competition comes in or if there's a major disruption in the marketplace.
But would you agree that that would require that these incumbent organizations would have to routinely, to some extent, test their assumptions around who their target customers are, what the value proposition is, even if the target customers are the same, or needs to stay the same, are they delivering the right value proposition? Because then that would drive potential changes in the actual activities that they have to deliver that value proposition. Does it start there, or is the organization just thinking about, well, how do I improve the way I deliver that value proposition and make it better? Because that's really just making tweaks to the existing business model, right?
Well, I don't think I think there's an and there, not an or, right? So whenever we have sets of products and services, we need to continuously make sure that those maintain relevance to our customers, right?
Right,
Obviously, that value proposition needs to be fresh and needs to evolve. And of course, part of that's a marketing challenge and part of it's a product development challenge. But you used a word earlier about assumptions, which I think is really important in a sense that what the insurgent firm does is continuously always tests and challenges the assumptions about the market, about the customer and how they perceive the value in the market, about how competitors are competing, and what's the right recipe to compete, right? So that's kind of hardwired into how we think about the insurgent firm. So
yeah,
that side of it is, let's just take an example. If we had an existing customer or existing set of customers that, let's say those customer relationships are maturing, it's always an option for a firm to step back and think differently about how that value is created and delivered, right? So
right,
in essence, that might suggest that a different business model delivered to the same set of customers could deliver more value for both the firm and the customer. Whereas the incumbent mindset is buy more of my products, right? So
right.
the next iteration of the same product on the same model. And I think that's a really fundamental difference in how these firms think about strategy, product development, market engagement, et cetera. And to me, that creates a very stark kind of contrast between what an insurgent mindset is and how the incumbent behaves.
Yeah. One of the things that we haven't touched on yet is this, this concept that the insurgent organizations see themselves operating more in an ecosystem as opposed to the incumbents, which thinks more about a value chain. And I think that concept of the ecosystem, if I think of an Apple, for example, and its 1.5 million developers, or the mobile partners that are so important to the value that an iPhone and iPad creates for customers, that ecosystem is important. They're not employees of the company, but yet they need, and also customers. Customers add ideas that make the Apple products better. So having that kind of mindset is a little different than what incumbents think, because the incumbent organizations want to be able to control areas of the value chain that they feel are to their advantage, and they're all about sort of managing and removing risk. Whereas the insurgent organization takes on a little bit more risk because they are working through partners or customers. They see them as a part of their ecosystem.
I agree completely. One of my colleagues from way back, Jim Moore, wrote a book called The Death of Competition, which sort of introduced this idea of business ecosystems. Would have been about 25 years ago. Very important idea, which has now become pervasive in the way we think about things. So I think you're right. It's sort of that comes back to that zero sum concept that I shared with our listeners a minute ago, where it's almost like the incumbent firm likes to create a fortress around the firm. Okay. And that fortress is built on the assumption that we need to kind of do as much as possible in-house and hoover up or gather up as much of that value internally, where insurgent firms often, not always, often these firms have less resources available, and they have what I would describe as a more open architecture as a firm in terms of their ability to plug and play capability from a partner ecosystem, or indeed even a customer ecosystem. Often these firms are working back and forth, co-creating with customers dynamically, where the customer becomes the partner often. And this open architecture creates an opportunity to pivot in very surprising ways to identify new opportunities, where the big the big firms, their ecosystem tends to be in a master-slave supplier relationship,
Mhm.
typically, where their partners tend to be supply chain partners, to your point about the value chain, where
Right.
those partners might be providing sub-assemblies to reassemble into a factory to deliver value at the end. But in essence, the firm still has the mindset of, we need to control all the means of production. Whereas insurgent firms are much more horizontal in their thinking. The question is, as you pointed out, how do we add maximum value to customers, and how do we stitch together the capability at different times to make that happen? And that happens externally in
Right.
terms of building partner relationships that can kind of come and go. But it also happens internally in terms of how they lead their people, where those vertical hierarchies break down, and you're always looking to assemble talent to work on projects and programs that deliver new sources of value, and then blow those up and reassemble them in different ways and so forth. It becomes just a way of doing business that is fundamentally and inherently dynamic.
What do you say to people? I had this come up in a session I did recently. What do you say to people? That just sounds so hard. That's an organization that's moving fast. When do we get a chance to breathe?
Right.
It's
Okay.
always
Well, this is
changing. Things are always changing.
things are always changing. It's funny, really, because some things are changing very slowly and some things are changing very quickly, right? But if you zoom back and sort of look at, um, I don't want to get too caught up in sort of orienting our conversation too much to the tech environment, but let's be honest, cycle times or product development lead times or time to
Mhm.
market is
Mhm.
compressing, where we have these certain products that are coming to market that are gathering up, tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people uh, in a very short period of time. And this sort of shift where some of these firms are big firms, like we saw during COVID, the development of these vaccines, whatever you think about the vaccines, an 8-year cycle compressed down to about a year,
A
and
year. Yeah.
that becomes the expectation now for how to deliver that sort of value at scale in that sort of time frame. You can't do the old slow mobilization thing in that environment. So, fundamentally, I think that's one force coming at you. And then to your point about it all seems too hard, I think that's really important too, in a sense that if you don't have the insurgent mindset of how to assemble talent, how to assemble
Right.
capability, how to build a responsive organization to market, you're going to default to the incumbent mindset, which is, how do I do what I do better, faster, cheaper, extract more value from the existing model, and do that as long as I can get away with it, and then hopefully parachute out before the whole thing comes to grief. And
Right.
I think, Rondo, since we're running short on time, I think we're going to sort of start to unravel all these different points in more detail, as I mentioned at the beginning, with real case studies, some guests that will come and join our podcast, and we'll try to unpick each of these elements in our podcasts one at a time and kind of really get some depth to kind of understand what these key insurgent characteristics are, to help our listeners build up uh, the ingredients to help them sort of develop the insurgent mindset, develop the insurgent firm, and to build the insurgent culture. Fundamentally, those three things we talked about before. So, this is a great topic, and I think it'll be really fun also to get listener feedback and start to create a dynamic environment here where we can hear case studies and examples from firms that
Right.
are doing this kind of thing, that are really working hard to build these mindsets, and hear from firms that are caught in the incumbent trap that can't seem to get out of it. Coming back to your point, how do I do it? How do I
Yeah.
change it? How do I change my own behavior? I think it's going to be really fun to kind of unravel these ideas.
And I also think it will be great to hear what's on the listeners' minds as it relates to insurgents and incumbency, and being able to talk about and respond to the questions that they may have about those two different types of organizations as well.
All right. Well, let's take that as a challenge then, Rondo. We'll pivot into our next podcast to pick a theme, maybe customer proximity or partner ecosystems, and we'll do a deep dive on that, and we'll start to really bring to life the characteristics at a level of detail. And as the podcast evolves, we can almost imagine these being chapters in the Insurgent story. And as I mentioned before, we can reinforce those with some real life case studies that sort of bring these ideas to light.
Sounds great. I'm looking forward to it.
All the best, Rondo. Thanks so much. And I look forward to seeing you in our next go around.
Absolutely. Thanks, Matt.
All right. Cheers, Rondo.